Every now and then, a video game comes along that makes you stop and especially consider its nature. Sometimes the experiences they offer can be unlike anything you've ever seen before. For me, there have been several video games throughout my life that invoke a certain set of feelings and thoughts that not many others can. The best way I've found to describe these games is by comparing them to dreams. We're going to go through a selection of games that I've personally picked out. As we go on with this list, we'll be noting specific aspects in gameplay, presentation, and anything else that we can pick up on. And by the end of it, we'll try and break down why I think these games feel the way that they do. Also, a big part of these games is going into them somewhat blind, so I won't be delving too far into story details or any spoilers for their end sections. But if you see something on here that you're interested in and want to go into it completely blind, then I'll have chapters so you can skip to the next game. So, without further ado, let's get into our first game. Starting off our list is a game that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, only something is different. This isn't the Super Mario 64 that you've grown accustomed to. A year before this game was released to the public, Nintendo hosted Space World 1995, a gaming trade show where they traditionally show off their latest products. This year featured Mario's jump into the third dimension. Looking back on this footage now, fans will notice several differences between these demos and the full game. This has led some people to try and uncover some past build of the game, but others took a different approach. There's a few projects out there with large teams devoted to altering the release game to more closely resemble its past versions. A lot of really cool stuff has come from this search. But Mario 64 also gained popularity for a bit of a different reason in the past few years. A lot of people have a very close and personal connection with this game, and some parts of the internet would try and come up with a reason to justify this. Suddenly, a bunch of creepypastas would pop up around the game, and every copy of it is now personalized. So, Chris Brutal Aggression and his dev team would combine these ideas with the beta recreation aspect and make a huge ROM hack for the game. This is B3313, or Super Mario 64 Internal Plexus. I know that exposition was really complex and long-winded, but I think you lose out on something if you don't understand the context behind this hack. So let's actually get into its content. This is a really wild experience, especially if you spent a lot of time playing the original Mario 64. As someone who has played it a lot, I've grown very accustomed to every twist and turn the game has. So, walking in the castle and seeing an entirely different interior is a bit disorienting. The wallpaper is different, the layout is different, the font is different, everything is different. The disconnect between what I know the game is supposed to be and what I'm being presented with is already enough to show some dreamlike qualities, but if you're not familiar with the game, that's not really applicable to you. Where the game gets a bit more objectively dreamlike is in its gameplay. In the original game, you hop in a painting and go to another world. Here, you hop in a painting, go to another world, die in that world, go to a different castle, walk through a door, and after a while, you're not sure what's still the castle and what's a level. It's like when you're explaining a dream and it just ends up sounding like, I was going to the store, but when I opened the door, it was actually my middle school cafeteria. But when I turned around, I realized I was actually in the audience for that monster truck show I went to when I was 6 years old. It's hard to follow. And I don't say that to be mean or anything. It's one of the main aspects of the ROM hack. It can be hard to know where you are at any given moment. People still aren't even sure if everything's been discovered, even though the hack has been out for 2 years. But the world geometry is not the only dreamy thing at play here. Old 3D games have a certain atmosphere to them. The consoles they came out on weren't very strong yet, so a lot of interesting liberties are taken to get them up and running, which results in things like fog and low-resolution skyboxes. Under the right circumstances, the limitations of old hardware can result in some pretty unnerving and creepy environments. It's why the PlayStation 1 horror trend is as popular as it is now. These consoles unintentionally inspired a very surreal movement in gaming. Even the original Mario 64 had some areas like this, like Wet Dry World, a series of 2 submerged areas floating in a void encompassed by textures of an underwater town. It's weird. Scenes like this are only more apparent in B3313, and with an intangible world space, it feels like the whole thing was ripped straight out of a dream. If you want a familiar yet uncomfortable and surreal experience, I highly recommend checking this out. Our next game is also a mod, only of a very different game. Doom 1 and 2 have some pretty expansive and awesome modding communities. I've known this for a while, but I didn't personally enter the scene until I heard about MyHouse.Wad. Calling this project just a Doom level would be an insult to everything going on here. It's a creation by veteran Doom mapper Veg. He didn't just release a level file. He included several supplementary parts of a story that's being presented here. MyHouse.Wad, the actual level file itself, began as someone's recreation of their own house, as the name would imply. The creator of it was Veg's friend Tom. Upon Tom's passing, Veg would unearth this file and complete and polish it for everyone on the forums to experience for themselves. In the original post, the level is described as a roughly 10-minute tribute. In reality, it's not that simple. As we enter the level and I'm taking out these enemies, we can take in the scene around us. It is, indeed, a recreation of someone's home. There's not much of a fight being put up here, so it gives us a little time to look around. As we make our way downstairs, we can see a power-up outside, so we might want to check that out later, but I want to clear out the house first. Okay, I got all the key cards, so I'll look for it now. It's not there. And the enemies are back in the house. And the doors open differently. So that's a little weird on its own. The house changing and all the enemies respawning. You probably don't think this feels much like a dream at the moment, and it doesn't. Until you complete a set of tasks, which allows you to pass through a mirror, entering an alternate version of the house. Then you discover rooms you hadn't seen in the house before. Rooms that don't belong in the house. They don't fit in, physically and aesthetically. And in your exploring, you fall, only to rise again to yet another different house. All of this while a beautiful and haunting soundscape fills your ears. And you keep falling down this rabbit hole of dissimilar yet connected rooms and spaces, discovering path after path branching in different directions. It's a similar phenomenon to what I described in the last game on this list. Like a dream, where the passage between spaces is off and intangible. Almost every scene you uncover is somehow less expected than the last. Also similar to our last game, Doom is old. It's running on newer hardware here, but the low polygon count of the house and the lack of shading also lend themselves very well to a dreamlike experience. With these old engines, they're trying to replicate real life, but they didn't have the technology to do so. The final product is a beautiful yet uncanny amalgamation of what life should look like. Similar to how your subconscious will try to create logical scenes, but fails to get the finer details accurate. You can piece together hints of an actual story happening here, but while you're actually playing it, you're too caught up in its sights and sounds to really think about that. Only after you're done can you go back and ponder what you just experienced. The same way you would chronicle dreams in a journal and then look for the meaning in them. I mentioned supplementary story pieces in Veg's original post. There's a journal describing the process of recreating the map. There's photographs of Veg and Tom together. And there's sketchbook pages as well, showing the house and more. And that's the extent of what I'm going to share for this game. Rushing through it and being overly brief would really tarnish the experience you can have with it. If you're not able to play it for yourself, I highly recommend watching a long playthrough of it. Properly viewing this mod means seeing every second of it. It's surreal and it's wonderful, and it gives you glimpses into a greater story, one that you need to personally reflect on and derive your own meaning from. Some of the later scenes in this mod depict scenes that can be considered liminal. Whether or not that's intended from the actual author is not for me to say, that's just the vibe I get from them. The liminal space trend is one that's gotten very, very popular in the last few years. It might be cliche and it might be overdone, but I really personally like it. So our next entry on this list is going to be people taking this concept and putting it into a video game, which I think results in a pretty cool product. For the longest time, I never really got Garry's mod. I played Team Fortress 2, I played CSGO, I played Portal 2, so I figured I had played kind of all the Source engine could offer me, which is dumb in retrospect, and I'm very happy to have been proven wrong. Just in the past few months, I really tried the game. Most people probably just run around in the sandbox and build cars, and then run over people with said cars, but I just loaded up a bunch of maps and walked around them. It started out with a 7-Eleven map, then an H.H. Gregg, and then the classics like Construct and Flatgrass. But before we delve into what really hooked me, I want to talk about what GMod runs off of, the Source engine. Source is very interesting. It started being used in 2004, with roots dating back to the 90s, so it's a little dated. It's what most of Valve's games run off of, like Team Fortress, Counter-Strike, Portal, and Half-Life. The games themselves don't look very dated or bad, but their aesthetic is very distinct. One of the most notable parts of the engine is its lighting. Lighting in Source has never looked quite right. Usually it's serviceable, and sometimes it can be great. Now, I'm not a game developer, but within older Valve games and user submissions for GMod, there's some kind of lack of shadows or ambient occlusion or something. Not to mention that a lot of these levels are built off assets from Half-Life, a post-apocalyptic game, meaning a lot of these textures and models show a lot of wear, which can end up creating juxtapositions when they're used in a setting outside of Half-Life's. In a more brief sense, something just feels off. It's the same phenomenon we saw with the last two games' engines, but with Source, the internet has taken a bit more notice of it. The maps included with Gmod by default, especially Flatgrass and Construct, have been the subject of many liminal space conversations. Whether it's Flatgrass's infinite nothingness or Construct's empty, odd cityscape, a lot of people find these environments surreal. So, what better game to create liminal spaces in than Garry's mod? Everyone has their own reasons for liking this game, and this was mine. I downloaded several of these, and for hours I just walked around. I'd spent so much time looking at pictures of these spaces, and now I had the chance to walk around in them and look at them from new angles. This was a dream, but in a more literal sense, these maps are likely intended to have that dreamy atmosphere. One of the main hooks of liminal spaces in general was the concept of places that you know or have been to, but with something off about them. Like a mall with no people, a hallway to nowhere, or a hotel but indoors. They're scenarios that almost seem more likely to be conjured up by your subconscious. These places can look mostly right, but their place in existence is wrong and unreasonable. You witness jarring transitions or teleports from place to place, and they're locations that shouldn't be within miles of each other. When you're met with familiar yet uncomfortable scenes in a game that's only visually realistic half the time, it's going to be surreal. To witness that is one thing, but to be thrown into a labyrinth of rooms and hallways and fields with no direction or semblance of justification is something else. Something that I can only accurately compare to a dream. The places on display here are pretty commonly only possible in dreams. They're funhouse distortions of real-world spaces that should never exist, which makes it all the more unsettling to know that a lot of these are based on real photographs. So they do exist somewhere in the world. But what if these settings were based on dreams already? Instead of the game being a warped reflection of reality, what if it's a retelling of reality already warped by the subconscious? The other games I could rationalize and explain somewhat thoroughly, but I cannot do that with this last game. You may have seen it featured in Let's Plays, or just seen people talk about it specifically because of how weird it is. And if you haven't, then allow me to introduce you to 1998's LSD Dream Emulator. As the name suggests, this game takes you through dreams. Sober dreams, by the way, not those influenced by psychedelics, as the name might also suggest. These dreams had been chronicled into a diary, and then were reimagined for the PlayStation 1, as a piece of contemporary art, rather than a traditional video game. And that different approach definitely shows in its gameplay. Or I suppose it could be its lack of gameplay. Whereas the previous games we covered had surreal environments, teleporting, and intangible world spaces, LSD only has those. Progression in the game is limited to running around dreams that are sometimes more akin to nightmares. Occasionally, the player will bump into an object. Any object, actually. Whether it's the wall, a sumo wrestler, or anything that exists, you can and probably will teleport to another location if you touch it. The scenes here are not easy to describe. At points, it's more reasonable to assume that parts of the game are being randomly generated to some degree, which I believe does actually occur sometimes. Things just kind of happen. I mean, I saw the Hat Man. The game does have progression in the form of days, which I thought were 10-minute sessions of you walking around the dreamscape, but one of my days was just a quote, retelling a dream. One time I walked up to a sailor, and the whole game just turned into an FMV of an airplane hitting a sick trick. And then my day ended. It's sensory overload at its finest. It truly is a visceral experience. I don't dislike playing it, and I don't think it's bad by any means, but it's definitely not for everyone. It can be creepy and unsettling, just as much as it can be goofy and wacky. You can't really go into it with any proper expectations. But I think it's really interesting that this game came out so long ago. The other games I've covered here all share elements with this game. They all have teleportation, nonsensical geometry, and surrealist worlds. But I specifically find the teleportation to stand out here. Teleporting around is really a big part of dreams for a lot of people. We don't really think of the journey to get to places as much in our subconscious. And if we do, it can be limited to just still images of being there. Sometimes the easiest way for our mind to justify that transition is just by teleporting. And sometimes if our minds can't decide what the path to a certain place looks like, it'll create one, but it can be wrong. You don't reach a lake by jumping through a painting in a castle. You don't reach a tiled indoor pool from a hallway in your basement. And you don't reach a flooded waiting room from your house. These things aren't possible, but in a dream, they are, and they might even be more likely than the realistic option. So that's just a few of the games that I've played throughout my life that invoke feelings of being in a dream. That's not all of them, not even close. I had a list of over a dozen before I had to cut it down. But now that we've seen a few, let's try and solidify some common tropes from what we've showcased. Each game featured some sort of teleportation and/or nonsensical passages between spaces, often prompted by inconsequential or unassuming tasks, like walking through the mirror or colliding with any object. Each game presented a very unique and specific atmosphere, best described as surreal and at times unnerving. These games also didn't provide much in the way of exposition, at least none that would actually help the player navigate the game. There's definitely other shared aspects amongst these games, but I found those to be the most prevalent. But to be honest, I think part of the phenomenon can't really be described. Sometimes you just play a game and know that it feels a certain way. Even if you can't really place your finger on it, that feeling is there. If you felt this way about a video game, or maybe even several, it's very possible your definition of dreamlike could be different. So if there's any games that you think fit my definition of dreamlike, or perhaps your own definition, please feel free to share them in the comments. I'd love to explore this concept more and expand upon it in future videos. Thanks for watching till the end of the video. If you liked what you saw, please consider liking the video. And if you especially liked it, please consider subscribing to the channel. But of course, there's no pressure. Thank you so much for watching.